December 16, 1944. A frozen village on the Belgian border. The snow was heavy, the air biting, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones and refuses to leave. First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck stood silently on the ridgeline above Lanzerath, staring across the whitened fields toward the tree line where he knew the Germans would come. He was only 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the entire U.S. Army. But in that moment, he carried the weight of responsibility that few men twice his age could comprehend. The platoon under his command was small, just 19 men that morning, but their orders were simple, uncompromising, and terrifying. Hold this ground, hold it against whatever came, hold it at all costs. They could not know it yet, but within hours they would face one of the most extraordinary small unit battles of the Second World War. Outnumbered more than 20 to 1, these young Americans would delay an entire German regiment, backed by Hitler's elite SS armored spearhead, for nearly a full day. They would inflict staggering casualties, disrupt timetables planned at the highest levels of the German command, and alter the course of the Battle of the Bulge. For decades their actions were forgotten, buried under the chaos of war. But today, we know the truth. 19 young soldiers changed history from a frozen ridge in Belgium. To understand how they came to that moment, we have to go back to the beginning. Lyle Bouck was born into poverty in St. Louis, Missouri during the Great Depression. His childhood was a struggle for survival. His family moved constantly, chasing work and shelter, often ending up in drafty homes with no plumbing, no electricity, no heat in the winter. At just 15 years old, desperate to help feed his brothers and sisters, Bouck walked into a Missouri National Guard recruitment office. He lied about his age and signed up. Nobody asked questions. For $1 a drill day, he became a soldier. That single decision would define the rest of his life. Bouck quickly proved himself. By the age of 19, he was already a supply sergeant, sending most of his paycheck home to support his family. The hardships of his youth forged a resilience, a toughness, and a sense of duty that would serve him later when the odds seemed impossible. In 1941, with war looming, his unit was federalized, and he found himself participating in the legendary Louisiana maneuvers, massive training exercises that prepared the Army for the coming global conflict. He excelled, catching the attention of his superiors. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Bouck volunteered for officer candidate school at Fort Benning. 4 grueling months later, he graduated near the top of his class and became an instructor himself, teaching small unit defensive tactics to future officers. But he wasn't content to remain stateside. In 1944, he was sent overseas with the brand new 99th Infantry Division. By November, the division was deployed to the Ardennes Forest, a stretch of dense woods straddling Belgium and Germany. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place to season inexperienced divisions before committing them to major operations. American forces had advanced across Europe at breakneck speed since D-Day. Paris had fallen in August, Brussels in September, Antwerp soon after. Many believed the war was nearly over. Intelligence suggested the Germans were exhausted, their divisions shattered, their morale broken. The Ardennes was considered a safe place to post green units like the 99th. Nobody imagined it would soon become the site of Hitler's last desperate gamble. Bouck commanded the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. This wasn't a regular rifle platoon. It was an elite unit within the division, handpicked for toughness, intelligence, and skill with weapons. They were scouts, not shock troops. Their job was to creep behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and fade away, not to hold ground against overwhelming force. But in December, orders came down that would test them like never before. The village of Lanzerath lay in the northern part of the Losheim Gap, a natural corridor that had served as an invasion route for centuries. Whoever controlled it controlled the roads that led deeper into Belgium. On December 10th, Bouck and his men arrived and immediately began digging in. The ground was frozen solid, forcing them to chip and claw at the earth with entrenching tools. They carved out foxholes along the ridgeline northwest of the village, concealed them with snow and branches, and set their machine guns to cover the open field below. They strung tripwires with cans filled with rocks to alert them to infiltrators. They zeroed their weapons on a wooden fence halfway down the slope, creating a pre-sighted kill zone. 19 men against whatever came down that road. That was the reality. For days they waited. The forest was quiet but not silent. Bouck's scouts slipped behind enemy lines on night patrols, sometimes as far as Losheim, 10 miles inside German territory. They captured prisoners, interrogated them, and brought back reports. The men earned their combat infantryman badges in those tense weeks, though casualties remained light. Still, Bouck sensed something building. German activity was increasing, but higher headquarters dismissed the signs. American intelligence believed the enemy was beaten, incapable of launching a major offensive. That illusion shattered before dawn on December 16th. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the sky exploded. A massive artillery barrage thundered across an 85-mile front. Thousands of German guns opened fire simultaneously, pounding American positions, cutting telephone lines, and shattering trees into splinters. The ground heaved. Men were thrown against the sides of their foxholes. The concussion rattled teeth and made ears bleed. For nearly an hour, the barrage continued. When it finally lifted, the Ardennes was blanketed in choking smoke, shattered branches, and snow churned into mud and craters. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last gamble in the West. His objective was audacious: smash through the thin American lines in the Ardennes, drive to the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force a negotiated peace. To do it, he had gathered 3 armies, including the powerful 6th Panzer Army under SS Commander Sepp Dietrich. At its tip was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a hardened armored battle group with Tiger tanks, Panthers, and mechanized infantry. Hitler believed the Americans holding the Ardennes were weak, inexperienced, and complacent. He was right about their inexperience. He was wrong about their resolve. As the smoke cleared, Bouck's men peered through the trees and saw movement, hundreds of figures forming up in the distance. These were not exhausted conscripts. They were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite veterans hardened by years of combat. They moved with discipline and confidence, advancing in wide formation toward the village and the ridge beyond. Bouck's platoon waited silently in their foxholes. The men clutched their rifles, machine guns, and carbines, fingers tightening on triggers as the Germans drew closer. 75 yards, then 50. The fence line they had zeroed days earlier loomed in front of the enemy. When the Germans stepped across it, Bouck gave the command. The ridgeline erupted. Machine guns opened up in perfectly interlocking fields of fire, cutting swaths across the snow. Rifles cracked with deadly precision. Men dropped in waves. The 50 caliber heavy machine gun thundered from defilade, its rounds tearing through multiple targets at once. German soldiers tried to dive behind the wooden fence for cover, but the thin boards might as well have been paper. They were cut down mercilessly. In minutes, dozens lay dead or dying in the snow. The survivors broke and ran back toward Lanzerath. Against overwhelming odds, the Americans had repelled the first assault without a single casualty. The German commander was stunned. He had expected to brush aside token resistance. Instead, his lead companies had been decimated. He assumed he faced a much larger American force, perhaps an entire company supported by heavy weapons. But he couldn't afford delay. He regrouped, called down artillery and mortars, and prepared another assault. At midday, the second wave came. This time, the paratroopers advanced more cautiously, bounding from cover to cover, laying suppressing fire. Mortars crashed into the American positions, showering foxholes with dirt and shrapnel. Still, the platoon held. Their fire was precise, disciplined. Ammunition was precious. Every shot had to count, and it did. Once again the Germans were cut down in droves. The snow turned crimson. By afternoon the third assault began. Private Billy Queen, one of the artillery observers attached to the platoon, was hit in the stomach. He cried out, his comrades trying desperately to comfort him, but there was nothing to be done. He died within minutes. The platoon's only fatality that day. Sergeant William Slape manned the .50 caliber until the barrel glowed red-hot, then catastrophically warped and jammed. Their most powerful weapon was gone, yet still they fought on. For hours they held, refusing to give ground. By dusk, ammunition was nearly gone. Most of the men were wounded to some degree, ears ringing, hands numb from the cold and recoil. The Germans shifted tactics, probing for the flanks. Finally, as darkness fell, they slipped around the edges of the position. Foxhole by foxhole, they overwhelmed the exhausted Americans in brutal close-quarters combat. Bouck himself was shot in the leg and captured at gunpoint. One by one, the platoon was surrounded, dragged from their holes, and marched into captivity. 17 Americans were taken prisoner that night. 2 others had been sent earlier with messages and were captured later. Only a handful escaped. By every conventional measure, it was a defeat. The position was lost. The men were captured. But history tells a different story. The Germans had lost nearly 100 men killed or wounded in the assaults. More importantly, they had been delayed almost an entire day. When Kampfgruppe Peiper finally reached Lanzerath late that night, it found the road blocked by wreckage and bodies, its advance hopelessly behind schedule. The timetable that Hitler had demanded was already collapsing. That single day's delay had cascading consequences. American commanders, stunned by the offensive, now had precious hours to rush reinforcements. The 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, the 7th Armored Division, and later the 82nd and 101st Airborne all moved into blocking positions. Bridges were blown, fuel dumps destroyed. By the time Peiper broke free and pushed deeper into Belgium, his battle group was being harassed by tank destroyers, ambushed by infantry, and pounded from the skies. Within days it was cut off, its mighty armor abandoned in the snow, its men forced to flee on foot. Hitler's grand offensive had been fatally undermined by 19 men on a frozen ridge. For Bouck and his men, there was no triumph that night. They were marched east into captivity, crammed into cattle cars without food or water, watching comrades die of exposure and starvation. They endured months of misery in prison camps until liberation in April 1945. Many carried the scars for life. Some, like William James, would suffer years of surgeries before dying of their wounds long after the war ended. And when they came home, there was no parade, no fanfare, no recognition. Their stand had been lost in the chaos of the larger battle. Bouck himself received a Silver Star in the mail, without ceremony or explanation. The rest of his men got nothing. For decades they believed they had failed. They had been overrun, captured. They considered themselves defeated. It wasn't until historians pieced together the German records that the true scale of their achievement emerged. Their resistance had delayed the entire 6th Panzer Army. Their casualties inflicted were wildly disproportionate to their size. Their actions had bought time that saved lives and helped secure Allied victory. Slowly, recognition came. Journalists took up their cause. Congressional hearings were held. President Jimmy Carter signed legislation waiving the normal statute of limitations for awards. And finally, in 1981, nearly 4 decades later, the platoon was decorated as one of the most honored small units in U.S. history. 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 9 Bronze Stars for valor, and a Presidential Unit Citation for the entire platoon. Today a monument stands at Lanzerath Ridge, a simple stone marker on the slope where they dug their foxholes, overlooking the field where hundreds of German paratroopers fell. Each year, Belgian school children and American veterans gather there to remember. The story of 19 young Americans who stood against impossible odds has become part of history, a lesson taught in military academies around the world. For Lyle Bouck, the recognition was bittersweet. He went on to live a quiet life as a chiropractor, raising a family, rarely speaking of the war until later years. When he died in 2004, days before his 81st birthday, the New York Times honored him with an obituary that recognized the extraordinary courage of his platoon. The legacy of Lanzerath Ridge endures because it proves a timeless truth. In war, small units can change the course of history. 19 men delayed an army. Their courage bought time. Their sacrifice gave the Allies the chance to rally, to resist, and to win. They did not fail on December 16, 1944. They succeeded beyond measure. And so we remember them, not just as soldiers, but as ordinary young men who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most.